West Adams, West Adams Boulevard, from which the district gets its name, is the subject of this chapter. A grand old boulevard. You can see in the opening chapter page, that the title page for the chapter, you can see how it had the center aisles with the palm trees and with the flora. Unfortunately, they're now removed. In this chapter, the photographs are laid out sequentially from east to west. So we start all the way in the east, anchored as we are by the Stimson Mansion, Stimson House, and the AAA building, and then the St. Vincent de Paul Church. And we progress east. It's not all the buildings in West Adams, it's just the ones that struck my fancy that I thought would be good for this volume. And you go the 3.5 miles east towards we end at the Mcgowan Mansion. And I thought I could actually take a look at some of the photos, and I'll say a few things as I page through the chapter. So we'll start off with the Stimson Mansion. I've already mentioned in a previous chapter how it was used in the American soap Mad Men to represent a place in upstate New York. And you can see that, right? It almost looks like something out of an H.P. Lovecraft. You can sort of imagine a kind of a New England feel. It was used in the horror film House 2, I believe. And you can really get that vibe, right? As long as you hide or you shoot around or you digitally remove the palm trees. So that's at one end of Adams. That's just on Figueroa, which is another main street. Also, right there is the St. Vincent de Paul Church, which some say is a copy, though I don't know which one, a copy of a Mexican church. Look at the facade there and feel the vibe of it. Imagine that you're in Mexico, and a really impressive building that was endowed by the widow of Doheny. Doheny, of course, being the great oil baron of Southern California. And that's one of the cliches about LA and Southern California is true. We do have oil wells everywhere. In fact, there's one right here, right down the end of my block, like within a 30-second walk, if that. There's an oil well, and it is was a Doheny oil well. And it's still going, though I think some of the residents are not happy with it, and they're going to try to have it shut down or examined more closely for environmental, take a look at the environmental impact of it. But there are oil wells, throughout Los Angeles. It's one of the things if you're, for instance, taking a cab or you're driving from LAX or airport and you happen to go down La Cienega, or the swamp as it is in the original Spanish, you'll go past all these oil fields. But you're in a city, but there's oil fields there. And one is reminded of, Raymond Chandler. There, he visits may even be a colonel, which I guess is probably in reference to Doheny. Or someone like Colonel Stearns who visits the mansion and there's an oil well pumping in the background. And, what happened to the chauffeur? Do we ever find out? But the oil wells are around us. And that the oil wealth helped fund, Los Angeles and specifically West Adams. So Doheny, the widow of Doheny, endowed this church. And in fact, she got a lot of her friends to come and move into the area called St. James Park, which I've included in the North University Park section of this book. So you've got this amazing church. But across the street, there's a church of a different kind. The headquarters for the AAA in this area. And it's a church of a different kind, the Church of the Automobile. Now, in the United States right now, where I would argue that we're past peak auto, peak car. Car culture no longer has a hold on the cultural imagination and the economic imagination that it did. Think of films like American Graffiti from the early 70s that harken back to a time in the 50s when the car culture was one of the predominant cultures. We're no longer there. I've already mentioned in one of these commentaries that when I lived in a communal house with 20-somethings, a bunch of them, a dozen 20-somethings in Harvard Heights, nobody has a car, and they don't want a car. It's not just they can't afford it. You look at the polls that interview young people, and if they had a choice between a car and a smartphone, they'll go for the smartphone because it offers the same kind of thing that cars did, or cars, the marketing message of cars, which was freedom and communication, and the opportunity to canoodle at some level, right? You can get it on. That was the big fear. It's like, couples are gonna go off somewhere in the woods and get it on. And of course, now I guess they can. I don't know. The kids can just sext each other. I don't know. I'm too old. I don't know what's going on in there in the cyber webs. But anyway, we're past peak car, but we have the remnant of it here in West Adams with this amazing AAA building, which, if you're there in the flesh, and I don't know if some of this may have gotten across, I think one of the photos I have of it from the side with that great Morton Bay fig tree, it resembles nothing so much as an embassy. It's like an embassy to this the empire of the automobile. And in the early days of Los Angeles, the AAA held a huge sway. They were, according to various histories, directly responsible for writing a variety of laws. They had their own militia, apparently, and they helped design and further the culture and industry of the automobile in Southern California. It's one of the reasons why we have the geography of California, of Los Angeles County that we do, centered around the automobile. And of course, there's the famous stories, are apocryphal to some extent, of the track of our electric railways. We have the greatest number of miles, railway public transportation miles in the United States, and those were torn up and replaced with buses because of a syndicate of oil guys and tire guys. And there's a debate about how accurate some of that is, and you'll see it popularized in our culture in films like Who Framed Roger Rabbit. But there's no doubt that the AAA influenced to a vast extent the car culture in the U.S. And we have a remnant of it here, right in West Adams. If we move along, you'll see the former home of screen giant Norma Talmadge. What a fantastic place! Now you get that Tudor influence. You could almost see it being used as a set. Perhaps in one of the Baron Frankenstein's place. And of course, this is another thing about Los Angeles, is that you have the influence, often directly, of the production designers of the silent and then the great sound era of movies, influencing the architects or designing themselves. So many of our homes seem to be right out of a film set. If we move along here, the Second Church of Christ Scientists, which is now the Art of Living Foundation. It's a yogic center, and I believe, at least in terms of when I'm recording this in January of 2014, it's open a couple of evenings a week for yogic practices. And I understand they do a really nice vegetarian cuisine. But this, of course, stands out because of this massive copper dome. I believe the heaviest copper dome at that time that was built. And when you think about the impact of domes, of how you think about the basilica, you think about Rome and the display of power and magnificence that the dome symbolizes. For me, growing up when I was a young man and I moved to London, there was the Millennium Dome, which was this massive dome built for the millennial celebrations in 2000. And of course, the joke is that if you went in there, if you could get access before anything was put in, it was really something, this massive dome. But then they crammed it full of these really cheesy exhibits. I won't go into that here. But the dome itself was impressive. And I say this because of the way, very cleverly, very shrewdly, they've designed the access to the dome in this building, in the Art of Living Foundation, what's now called the Art of Living Foundation. You look at it from the outside, this huge dome, and the expectation is that you would go in and you'd be confronted by this amazing open space. But that's not the case. When you actually go in, and I have a photograph here of the stairways leading up to it, you enter a very low-ceilinged room with two stairways, all in marble. So you think about how dense marble is. So you almost feel like you're in a sarcophagus, you're in a mausoleum, you're in a tomb, very low, very dense. And then you go through the stairways, and then you're confronted. You come out in the back of this massive space with this huge dome. It's so large, I couldn't capture one photo. There's an actual collage, and as I say here, I took 26 photos. Right, you move the camera step by step to cover different parts of the room, of the space, and then you combine them. So this is an actual montage of 26 photos. It's really an astonishing experience. And if you're here in LA, I would suggest stopping by there. It's not necessarily open to the public except for those evenings for the yogic practice. But check that out. It's really something. In the last shot of the dome, you can see there's a little house in front of it, and that is a housing by USC. You could almost argue that's the North University Park area, and that's because Adams bisects and goes through so many neighborhoods in West Adams. So you can say, well, it goes through North University Park, it goes through, past Kinney Heights. So some of the other areas in this book, Adams will go along it. Next, we've got the A.E. Kelly residence, and this building, as you can see, it's not in the best shape. not in the best shape. You'll see photographs of the interior, but I'm happy to report that since these photographs were taken in 2012, the owner is now in the process of restoring it and doing it up. And he owns several Victorians here in West Adams, at least 3, I believe, that come to the top of my head. He bought them in the 70s, started in the 70s, and from what he told me, he was concerned. He felt that there was legitimate concern that USC, which is the university which is just to the south of West Adams, just abuts West Adams, and you'll see photographs more of kind of the USC area in the North University Park chapter. His concern is that USC was going to buy them and demolish them, because you always have these times, don't you, where we only realize in hindsight how wonderful some of these buildings were. And he's like, oh goodness, what were we thinking when we demolished that to make the way for a car park and what have you? So he and others in West Adams at that time, in the 70s and the 80s, especially when property could be got for, it was extremely inexpensive compared to today, he was concerned that something would happen and purchase them. But he is now restoring, to a certain degree, that house as far as I can see. As we move on, we've got, look at this, another fantastic Morton Bay fig tree. And how about this firehouse with the mission style? And this, of course, is what a lot of people think about Southern California. They think about these shingles. They think about a place like San Clemente, where Nixon famously retired to, which is, has hills that are just bedazzled with these shingled homes. That's Southern California style. Let's talk a little bit about the Golden State Mutual Life building, mainly because it was designed by Paul Williams, and Paul Williams was a huge name in Southern California architecture in the 20th century, head of the local organization of architects here in LA. And here we've got modernism, and look at how that building just uses the mass, right, without ornament, uses the mass to anchor the corner. A fantastic example of proportion, the use of proportion, composition. See how the windows, the horizontal windows, work with the verticals of the mass. And Paul Williams did so much stuff. He contributed to LAX, the famous swooping restaurant on the world that LAX has or had. And his home, a home he built for his family, is actually in Lafayette Square. And there's a couple of photographs of it in the Lafayette Square part of the Scratching the Surface epilogue chapter. I also include this brick building, which is home now to the Fame Assistance Corporation, because for me, even though it doesn't stand out with some of the other buildings in terms of exuberance, it captures how Los Angeles has been portrayed. The rough streets of LA. You think again of like Raymond Chandler, Philip Marlowe kind of thing. You can imagine a detective having an office there in the corner of that brick building. You've got the palm trees and the shadows on there. So to me, that's very classical LA, and I thought it would be fun to include in this book. We've got some other mansions like the Britt and the Fitzgeralds. Now this building is impressive, but also not just for its design, but it's been empty for so long there, dear viewer. And the reason, I think, is that to make it habitable, to live in it, you don't have to deck it out in marble and gilt gold everywhere, but just to live in it would take some time and some monies. Everybody I know here in West Adams, nobody can recall a time when people lived in it, when it was occupied. And every couple of years, you might read something in the paper. Apparently, I've gone back and looked at the archives, and there's like, oh, there's a prospective buyer. Someone's going to come in, and yeah, it hasn't happened yet. It would probably take, I don't know, $1 million, right, to make that a place to live in. I wanted to end with the 3 homes that have been restored by the Movement for Spiritual Inner Awareness, a group here in Southern California and elsewhere. They've put a lot of time, love, energy, monies into restoring the Guasti Mansion, the Briggs residence, and the Mcgowan. And I don't need to say too much about these because we've got Carol Jones from the MSIA. She spent a lot of time with me, taking me around and recording some oral history. So you can listen to her and what she has to say. But I did want to end on the Mcgowan Mansion, which is a fun collage of a building, right? This is the Mcgowan, the place that it's got the grotesques, those almost Punchinello-esque faces on the exterior. But inside, it's all over the place. So you've got the Tudor one room, and you turn the corner and go into a craftsman library. And one could argue, possibly successfully, that this shows a great lapse in taste, but it also shows a desire not to be bound by convention, and it shows a sense of exuberance and fun. And I'm reminded of when I lived and worked in Leeds, England. And Leeds was a big industrial commercial powerhouse in the 1800s. So a lot of money was spent producing these mammoth, highly decorated buildings in the 1800s, but very different from the buildings that were made at that time in London. I lived in London for over a decade, and in London, because London was the center of political, not just cultural and economic power in the 1800s, but the political power. Parliament is there. The buildings had to be serious, right? They had to represent empire and power, whereas a place like Leeds, farther away, it's a regional center, is not bound by those conventions, so we can have more of a spirit of fun and exuberance, which you can't show if you're running things, right? You can't be a clown if you're running things. And it's the same thing here in Southern California. So we're away from Washington, D.C. or New York, and so you can have the spirit of fun. You can put these grotesques on the outside of your building because you've run away. You're away from the center of things. And of course, that's one of the reasons why the film business started here. Why Hollywood became Hollywood is because the folks that were making movies did not necessarily at that time own the rights, or was disputed, own the rights to filmmaking equipment, which was owned by Edison. And so to escape the patent lawyers and Edison's gangs who might break up your film equipment, they fled as far away as you can from New York, which was here in Southern California, and the light was great. So that's why I wanted to end on the Mcgowan. Again, there's a sense of exuberance there, which makes it such a hoot, so fun, so much fun to live here in West Adams.